From the pipe dream that almost didn't exist to becoming one of the most iconic silhouettes in Xbox and gaming as a whole, the Lancer has been through many changes. Today we are going to take a look at the Lancer in all its glory throughout the last 20 years. For the sake of organization, I will not be discussing the Retro Lancer, as that deserves a video in its own right, even though it is technically the first iteration of the Lancer. However, because there is so much history in that weapon, and because I didn't feel like starting with Gears of War 3 to kick off this series, we are just focusing on the Lancer Mark II and beyond. For Gears of War 4, I will talk about the Lancer in both campaign and multiplayer, as they are different. Gears 5 becomes a bit more of a clusterfuck with the Lancer. I will try to keep it organized without going on too long. I do not include Gears Tactics because that game scares me. In the original Gears of War, we aren't introduced to the iconic Lancer until Act 1, Chapter 1, instead of donning a Locust weapon for the legendary breakout by Dominic Santiago to save his brother-in-arms, Marcus Fenix. Handed to the Embry Star Legend by Lieutenant Kim, the Lancer is immediately put to effective use, and from that point forward, it's clear why the gun became so iconic. Starting with the build of the weapon, it fits into Gears 1's atmosphere perfectly. It's dark with a metallic sheen, cut-out ventilation holes, a side-mounted chainsaw starter, automatic reload mechanism, and its hybrid SMG kind of assault rifle aesthetic with no stock and a heavy emphasis on the front of the weapon where the chainsaw lies. And we can't talk about the Lancer's profile without mentioning the piece that makes it stand out from its sci-fi brethren, the chainsaw. If I had to nitpick, there are two things about this version of the Lancer that lack sensibility. One is the classic meme of the franchise, where's the gas in the Lancer for the chainsaw, as it clearly emits smoke. And then of course, the sight for the Lancer makes no sense either. A round cutout for the rear sight and a black obstructed front sight make the weapon feel like it would be hell to aim. Overall, this entry to me is nearly the perfect iteration of the Lancer Mark II in Epic Games' vision. Next is the sound design. The high-pitched whine of the bullets and the noise of collision with the target are frankly some of the best features of the weapon. The clicking that occurs when you're running low on bullets all combine to make this semi-futuristic game feel grounded in its imperialistic take on the third-person shooter genre. If you close your eyes to the sound of the chainsaw, it's the exact sound of a standard gas power saw your divorced dad spends too much time trimming the hedges with. Simple, recognizable, and classic. And finally, let's talk about gameplay. The Lancer is a divisive weapon to this day, and in the original Gears entry it is no different. In the campaign, it is a sturdy and reliable weapon for crowd control and medium range, which are the majority of firefights throughout the game. It is almost always useful, especially with the active reload adding a substantial amount of damage. If you know anything about the lore of Gears, you know that dogs are far from Marcus's best friend. The Lancer, however, might be a contender. Always handy to have aside from edge cases, you could use the Lancer throughout the vast majority of the campaign without needing to swap weapons and be just fine. Though its Locust counterpart, the Hammer Burst, is an equally usable weapon featuring higher damage but burst fire. Multiplayer is where things get hairy. The Lancer is usable in the campaign, but there's a reason the Nosher shotgun meta became so popular even to this day, and it stems from the Lancer's poor performance in the original title. Without an active reload, the Lancer feels more akin to a Nerf gun than a real weapon, only waking up with an active reload. It's often the first weapon swapped for something better in the sandbox of Gears 1, not to mention the crosshair. No bloom or indication of where your bullets are going, it's just a sturdy hexagon that stays in the center of your screen. Though I have a lot of nostalgia for this reticle, I can attest that future iterations do a better job. It is also ineffective at crowd control, with very little stopping power. In all, the original Gears of War Lancer is iconic, but it stems from the game's art design and sound design, while the actual use case of it varies depending on what mode you're playing. It sets the tone of Gears of War, a gritty, dark world with an undertone of gallows humor. In 2008, Marcus was back with his brothers in arms. We get the Lancer immediately this time, trying to hold the last of Pomeroy Depot and the Jacinto Medical Center against the new era of the Locust. Enemies with more variants and tools at their disposal to destroy the last bastion of humanity, Jacinto. In this all-out war, it still often boils down to one man and his chainsaw ripping through flesh to get to the heart of the hive. In terms of visuals, the Gears 2 Lancer gets a massive overhaul from the original, equipped with more identifying LEDs as well as a laser-guided crosshair on both the front and rear sights, deeper, more realistic ventilation holes on the sides, color variants between different blocks of the weapon, and more texture work done overall. It still works the same way though, with the active reload and chainsaw all kind of working the same as before. However, this Lancer does feel more futuristic and sci-fi oriented than its original counterpart, almost like the vision of the original Lancer brought to life thanks to better graphical fidelity. However, with all these futuristic upgrades, the muzzle of the weapon seems to be, from a realistic standpoint, worse than the original rendition, glowing red hot the more lead gets pumped through it. A cool effect in the game where realism kind of takes a step back, but practicality-wise, melting your muzzle probably isn't the smartest thing to do in a gunfight. It emits a black smoke when the chainsaw is revved, its teeth biting through Locust Hide, no problem. With this sound design, the Gears 2 Lancer pays homage to the original while sounding needier and more grounded. Gone is the high-pitched bullet spray of the original, instead sounding more real, with a deeper tone and more elements to the sound the Lancer makes overall. Have a listen.
Let's do this.
The chainsaw largely sounds the same, but there's a new animation for sawing a locust through its hindquarters. The biggest changes to this weapon, though, are its gunplay. Still a reliable all-rounder in the campaign, but with a drop in ammo count and magazine size. With 550 bullets in reserve as a maximum, one that rarely gets hit thanks to sparse ammo boxes, and a 50-round mag instead of 60, the Lancer feels only slightly less like a keep forever gun and a more expendable version in this sandbox. However, only slightly. Well, there's also a new chainsaw dual mechanic, which saves us from the argument of netcode and tick rate complaints from the first game. Now each player has a chance to match B to save their skin and tear through the others. Multiplayer is where the biggest change occurs. It introduces heavier stopping power, giving it a place firmly in the sandbox of multiplayer for medium range encounters and slowing an enemy's progress. While it is now an optional start that can be traded for the beloved Gears 2 Hammer Burst, it still holds value against the enemy team thanks to its buff and power. Still largely a crowd control weapon, giving the spotlight to the Nosher for one-on-one encounters, it is a reliable option for game modes like Annex and Guardian. In Epic Games' finale to the franchise, the Lancer returns one more time, but it's become clear that resources are becoming extremely dry. Rarely is it used as the main weapon of Delta, but for Marcus, it's still his extra limb, always by his side. However, this time, it must face a new threat, the Lambent. With explosive enemies unveiling the truth behind the war, will the iconic weapon still be viable? Well, I argue that the Lancer in Gears 3's biggest antagonist isn't Queen Mira or mutated Locust. No. Its biggest enemy is its predecessor, the Retro Lancer. While only seen briefly on Gears 2, Gears 3 had to find a way to incorporate the Retro Lancer while still ensuring a spot in the sandbox for the Mark II and the Hammer Burst, which also saw dramatic changes from its previous iterations. Visually, the Lancer went through some smaller changes. Instead of a glowing blue reticle, it was replaced by a more World War II era iron sight. Of course, it is higher poly as well. Oh, and you can make it pink. The sound is further refined to make the Lancer sound more like a real gun, as opposed to a sci-fi interpretation of what a gun might sound like, with a meatier, bassier sound design for both the shooting and the sawing. The Lancer had to go through some changes to be viable. Gone is the wimpy 50-round magazine for Gears 2, instead going back to its original at the cost of less overall ammo. At a remarkably low 420 bullets, and a redesigned crosshair to boot, its tight bullet dispersion, low recoil, and strong bullet magnetism, the Lancer was back and better than ever. Not to mention the active reload, which boosted rate of fire, damage, and faster projectile travel. However, with the new loadout system in Gears 3, the Lancer still felt overshadowed by the Retro Lancer and Hammer Burst, which, while requiring more skillful usage, were great at filling their niches. The Lancer is still an all-rounder, but with a practically non-existent learning curve and lack of defining characteristics. It was largely overshadowed in the multiplayer sandbox, especially when considering its stopping power had been reduced from Gears 2's. Even in the campaign, it feels less important than before, with Player 2's character Dom often starting with a hammer burst to add to the ambiance of reduced manufacturing by the end of the Locust War. With that said, in campaign the Lancer is still the sturdy best friend, and when multiplayer equilibrium is out of the question, it is a remarkably well-tuned weapon that carries the legacy of the chainsaw into the chilling conclusion of the original trilogy. Now, I'm going to take a second to gripe here. In the established canon of the Gears of War franchise, the weapon of the COG should have been the Mark I Lancer, or what's commonly referred to as the Retro Lancer, as it takes place during the early months of the Locust War, when the weapon was but the glimmer of an idea in Marcus's eye as he watched Ty use a commercial chainsaw. However, with the many staggering changes to Judgment's playstyle, I theorize that getting rid of the Lancer's silhouette would strip the identity of the game completely. If Judgment hadn't changed so much from the prior games, I believe that it could have done without the chainsaw bayonet. With the major changes to gameplay, the Lancer had to change with it. In an attempt to make Gears of Duty Black Ops, the active reload buffs are removed from multiplayer altogether, and instead of being a high damage weapon like in Gears 3, the Lancer was once more reduced to a crowd control weapon, drastically reducing any chance it had to be chosen by players. In Judgment's crowded sandbox and loadout system, it's weak. Unlike in other games, in Judgment your loadout is cut by one weapon, meaning that any hope for tactical gameplay went out the window. Why would you choose a crowd control weapon when there are real heavy hitters like the classic Hammerburst and Nosher respectively? But possibly the worst change to the sandbox for the Lancer was the introduction of the quick melee system, meaning that instead of the chainsaw being the first choice, it was relegated to only when showing off, because the butt of the Lancer became the quick melee king. And of course, with the removal of the down but not out system in Judgment, it was either kill fast or die young. You couldn't get a cheeky down on an enemy and let your Nosher wielding buddy swoop in for the kill. Now, if you haven't read the Gears of War books, then you may not know that Marcus and Ty were both integral to putting the chainsaw on the gun. And in another feat of non-meat-headedness, he creates what is, in my opinion, a much more aesthetic version of the Lancer. Now adorned with a wooden stock and tilted magazine that fixed the jamming problem that was oh so prevalent in the Mark II, it also still retains a remnant of a time long gone. Now adorned with a removable flashlight, while this is the largest physical change to the weapon in the franchise thus far, it is purely cosmetic aside from the flashlight. As in multiplayer, it functions the same as the Lancer Mark II, with being nothing more than a skin. The original design of the Lancer is what's used in the majority of multiplayer gameplay, as there's about 300 million skins for it. The design of the Mark II Lancer is also changed, sporting the blue LED reticle of Gears 2 and a profile similar to Gears 2 as well, but with a now usable front sight that no longer blocks the view of the target. Sound-wise, it harkens back to Gears 1 and 2 with a higher pitched shooting noise and lighter, more natural sounding chainsaw. Overall, I feel this game gives the Lancer less oomph than 3, but everyone has their own preferences. Now, we can't talk about the Lancer in Gears 4 without talking about the massive changes to how the multiplayer plays. Now, instead of firing blindly at the start of a round or encounter, active reloads are not tied to the emptying of a magazine. Instead, you can actively reload whenever you'd like to gain a boost as long as the new cooldown system isn't active. Going back to a 50-round mag and a 550-round maximum ammo, it retains the Gears 3-like brutish force and core tuning, albeit with much less stopping power. However, in the new and widely controversial competitive tuning, the Lancer acts much more like a suppression weapon similar to the first game in the franchise, ensuring the Nosher meta for pros in esports and people who pretend that they have a chance to be in esports. Now, this video would have taken me twice as long to make and be twice the length if I went over every single Lancer in the game in Gears 5. So here's a brief overview of all Lancers in Gears 5. There's the Retro Lancer, the Lancer Mark II, the Custom Lancer, the Lancer GL, the Lancer Mark III, and relic versions of all of them. But you can only use the Custom Lancer and Mark II Lancer in the campaign, and while I would talk about them, I want to focus on the actual interesting stuff. Notably, it seems like the Coalition was attempting to rid the Mark II Lancer of its status as part of the campaign, as you can only pick it up from enemies when you're not holding the Mark III. Otherwise, it just becomes ammo. But the same can't be said for the inverse. If you're holding a Mark II, you'll pick up the Mark III instead of having it turn into ammo. The Mark III Lancer is Baird's attempt at turning the Custom Lancer into a mass-producible, more robust version of the Custom Lancer with its own subtle changes. Along with the stock being metal now, the front sight is much larger and, in my opinion, almost looks goofy. It is probably the most realistic-looking iteration of the Lancer, but that doesn't mean I have to love everything about it. Gameplay wise, I think this meme kinda sums it up. The recoil is all over the place with plenty of variability to keep it completely random and much harder to use than say Gears 4. But it is more powerful than that iteration at the cost of even less bullets. Remember when there were 60 bullets in a Lancer? Pepperidge Farm remembers. Now it's a measly 40. What next? Rising gas prices on Sarah are going to reduce the usage of the chainsaw? Though the raw damage is still pretty low, the stopping power saw a massive buff, making Lancer spamming the most annoying thing in existence! At least before the Lancer took skill. Now, if you're anywhere from media short range, contain at least 2 brain cells, you could win while playing through the fire and the flames in Guitar Hero on expert difficulty. I will forever hate the fact that active reloading was all but eliminated from the franchise by this point, but if the Lancer had an active reload, I think I would have used a Hammer of Dawn on the Coalition Studios. The chainsaw saw an even bigger reduction in usage thanks to the quick melee feature becoming the new standard bind for melee, and the chainsaw was now relegated to the lowly right bumper instead. Now, I gotta admit the Lancer GL is kinda cool, but honestly it's not really a Lancer anymore. I would have named it the Lancer of Theseus, because not only does a grenade launcher replace the chainsaw, but the overall ammo is reduced, the rate of fire is faster, and the recoil is immensely more controllable, turning it into a functional close to mid-range laser beam with some practice. The grenade launcher is more of a mortar than a grenade launcher, sending a homing rocket in the sky and crashing down. This is invariably useful in games like King of the Hill where players are all bunched together. I really like this iteration of the weapon. I'm going to keep this section brief because frankly these games are dumb. The Lancer in Reloaded and Ultimate Edition are both a redesign of the Gears 1 Lancer, so it's functionally the same weapon. However, the design did change a bit visually and audibly. It sounds more like the Gears 4 and 5 variants with a high-pitched but less fake-sounding version of the OG rattle. The reticle is different, showing a visual indicator for the weapon's bloom, and the graphical design has grown on me quite a bit. It's a faithful recreation, but with a realistic addition of a cutout on the front sight. It is still a dark version of the Lancer and not as zooky as future iterations, and probably the one thing that I actually like about the art style of Gears Reloaded. Now, for E-Day, I'm optimistic that the Coalition will do the right thing and keep the Mark II completely out of the campaign, especially if they keep the tuning of the Retro Lancer as it is in Gears 5, maybe with a fun little chainsaw section, but frankly I hope that the Lancer Mark II is either only present in multiplayer or not at all. We don't need to ruin the frankly amazing lore that Karen Travis built around this time period of E-Day. The Lancer is one of the most iconic weapons of all time, and for good reason. The silhouette gives it a wacky but grounded feel, and no matter what campaign you play, it always has its place in the story visually and as a utility. While it's gone through many changes over the span of its lifetime, I find that from a visual perspective, the Lancer has only gotten better. The stock of the newer games makes it feel more realistic and grounded, yet nothing beats a classic. Let me know if you'd change anything with the current version of the Lancer. And thank you so much for watching this video. If you want to see more, let me know in the comments down below what weapon you'd want to see next. Like, subscribe, do what you usually do, and as always, buy yourself something nice.